Hi everyone, welcome to another session on Prorian. Today we have a discussion on post-trial access to medicines after the completion of a clinical study. Now this subject, it sits at the intersection of ethics, regulation and real-world execution. While global frameworks set expectations, delivery remains uneven across regions. In today's discussion with Rahul, we're going to explore how Asia and the world is navigating this gap between principle and practice and what the future model holds realistically. Hi, Rahul.
Hi, Jacob. Thanks for inviting me.
You're welcome, and I'm glad we are talking on this subject today. For our viewers, Rahul is a seasoned regulatory affairs and pharmacovigilance leader with extensive experience across pharmaceuticals, biologics, devices, and consumer health. He brings a strong track record in approvals, portfolio strategy, cross-functional leadership, delivering complex regional outcomes. Rahul, welcome. Any starting thoughts, anything you'd like to say to our viewers as we begin this subject?
I would like to start by saying that it's a relatively new topic. Post-trial access was an ethical consideration for a very long time, and the ethical principles expected post-trial access to be one of the considerations while any clinical development program. But it's no more just an ethical consideration. There are regulators involved in it. There is expectation to have post-trial access clearly defined before the trial starts. And I'm also trying to learn. And today my intention is to share whatever I have seen so far and whatever we have experienced in this subject.
Absolutely. And I think regulatory folks and the broader community will all benefit from an Asia Pacific perspective, but also points that are relevant globally. So, first of all, why is this important? Why has it started to become a point of discussion for us to be surfacing this?
See, let's understand what is the definition of post-trial access in various good clinical guidances. Post-trial access refers to continued provision of an investigational medicine to the patients after they have completed participation in a clinical trial. And because they have participated in the trial and they got benefit from the treatment, now the question is, how are we going to manage these patients between the completion of trial and the commercial availability of the product?
Yes.
So this period between clinical trial and commercial availability is a crucial period where if patients are getting benefit on the drug and they are not getting the regular supplies of the drug, the benefits they got from the trial may no longer be available and their condition may start getting deteriorated. And that's the basic principle behind any GCP expectations on post-trial access.
And you believe that regulatory plays a key role in this discussion?
I think regulatory is one of the key players participating in this discussion. And as a regulatory affairs professional, we are a bridge between regulators and the commercial organization or the R&D organization. So it's very important as a regulatory profession that we understand the expectations and then understand how expectations are evolving. And I'm sure many viewers will agree that often we also participate in the development of regulatory landscape where we are contributing to industry's perspective, patients' perspective, and sometimes the investigators' perspective as well.
That's right.
So I think we play a very important role.
Yeah. And I think that's so important. And regulatory specialists are taking care of getting dossiers ready, filing them, going through the review process, communicating responses to questions, and then approvals. But there are many other topics in a practical regulatory environment where regulatory specialists are called upon for decision making, and post-trial access could be one of those important topics as well. So if we step back and look at this subject, can you share a little bit about how the perspective is globally? How are countries where you have sophisticated agencies, strong ethic bodies, better understanding among the general populace. How is the perspective from a high level?
Okay. I think it'll be important to look at the global regulatory
Yeah.
framework, especially framework like
Mm.
ICH or WHO
Yeah.
guidelines, where the message is consistent, clear that post-trial access must be considered, planned, and disclosed in advance. So more and more focus is towards uh, disclosing post-trial access plans before the clinical trial is approved or implemented in the
Got it.
countries. Now, there are few countries where it is a regulatory mandate to have post-trial access, but there are other countries where they have the ethical framework or referencing to one of these, either ICH or WHO guidelines, more like a guideline. From regulators'
Mhm.
point of view, it's more of a guidance, but the ethics committees are taking an active position in ensuring post-trial access. So there is this third bucket
Okay.
also where ethics committees are ensuring post-trial access.
What about patients? Are there any patient advocacy groups engaged in trying to influence access to medicines after trial?
I think globally, US, Canada, or Europe, they have very active patient
Hmm.
advocacy groups. And these groups are not new. They are functioning for multiple decades in these countries. And they have gained scientific
Mm.
insights that they are not just ensuring equitable access, but they are contributing towards building regulatory landscape in these. So they're fairly evolved and they're playing a very active role. However, when we come to Asia Pacific or emerging markets, our patient advocacy groups are evolving, and especially in rare cases, the rare disease or orphan indications where patient pool is limited and so is the availability of people for advocacy of these subjects. However, I would say things have started evolving at a much faster pace post
Ah.
COVID. There is also an increased attention and interest from political
Mm.
side as well. The biggest dilemma for any investigator is managing those patients after completion
Mhm.
of trial. How are they going to manage standard of care? What are the tools they have in their hands to manage these patients effectively till the investigation drug is commercialized? Now, from the ethics
Mhm.
committee, they have a couple of principles while deciding on whether post trial access should be given or not. As a patient who's been contributing actively to the clinical trial, the ethical principle is whether after the completion of trial, are they given equitable opportunity to access the medication which was
Yes.
benefiting them. And then from regulators' point of view, I think regulators are also linking post-trial access to trust and
Mm.
fairness. Whether we were fair with the trial participants who contributed towards this research and progressing the clinical investigation program of the drug. So I think all the stakeholders, be it the investigators, ethics committees, regulators, or the patient himself or
Mm.
herself, has expectations to ensure that the benefits which were observed during the clinical trial are being consistently provided. I would say our biggest challenge in this area is
Mm.
uncertainty. So the clinical program is just getting started, but we have to consider a hypothesis that the drug will be
Yes.
successful and the clinical trial will achieve its primary
Yeah.
outcome. And with this, can you start planning for what happens after the
Yes.
completion of clinical
Yes.
trial? So it's a very unique
Yes.
situation where we expected to have successful outcome and then start working on planning for time after
Yeah.
clinical trial.
Yeah. That's I think a very important point to remember, that as organizations and as individuals, it's not about just trying to find a one socks fits all solution. Or in other words, we cannot find a solution that is common across market.
Yeah, the lack of harmonization across countries, across geographies, and the expectations of post-trial access varies widely from region to region, from even countries to countries. There are countries where it is mandatory, and then there are countries where it is near
Mm-hmm.
mandatory, and then the third set of countries where it is ethically driven but flexible in terms of decision making between the ethics committee and
Yeah.
sponsor. And when we are conducting a multi country trial or a multi
Mm-hmm.
region trial, there are different commitments expected in different countries. So now this is again a scenario where a country like India or Brazil, where it is a mandatory requirement to have post trial access, the post trial access plans could be different from the countries where it is more of an ethical consideration. However, the ethics committees in this global world, they are sharing notes across the borders, and then they may see this difference, and it may again be construed as it's not equitable access when it comes to
Sorry,
different
can I
countries.
just interrupt you for a second, Rahul? Is it for orphan drugs or critical life-saving medicines?
So this is not captured in any ethical principles or the regulations, but the expectations are tighter when it comes to rare disease, when it comes to life-threatening conditions like
Yes.
oncology. Not just regulators, but even ethics committees are very careful in ensuring, because the overall survival rate depends upon continuity
Yes.
of the drug. So they're very careful and can be very stringent in such cases. But in case of acute care drug, they may not be determined on post-trial access principles upfront. Secondly, when the standard of care is available and good, there also we have seen PTA principles are more
Okay.
relaxed. So it's considered very practically by all the stakeholders involved in this. Apart from what we discussed, different standards for different countries, I think it also extends into operational and logistical complexities. Continuing treatment outside
Mhm.
the trial is not as simple as keep giving the drug.
Yes.
So it has to be controlled
Yes.
environment, because of course the drug is still investigation, it's not approved in any of the geographies. Then another point was on manufacturing and supply
Yeah.
continuity. Usually clinical trial batches are smaller in size, and once the clinical trial requirements are over, the manufacturers usually start moving towards increasing the
Commercial.
batch sizes to make it more commercial size batch. So this transition is also very important for the sponsor
Yeah.
company, and the expectation of post trial access can sometimes pose challenge in transitioning to commercial size lots. Now, there are also some region specific challenges, like in Brazil, there are specific labeling requirements for post trial access. So, once the trial is finished, you will have to ensure that the labels are updated to meet post trial access labeling requirements. Then comes pharmacovigilance
Yeah.
responsibilities. We do not have these drugs available commercially. However, if the patients are taking, we need to ensure that they have access to report any event that they may have faced. So there are multiple logistical challenges with this process. And as I shared with you, that the planning is expected to happen before the initiation of trial. So we
Upstream.
have to also, from financial point of view, keep the open-ended cost
Right.
exposure. So we cannot determine what would be the overall cost of this
Yeah.
clinical trial. So I think that's a bit. I would not say it's a big challenge, but that's an internal understanding within the organization that needs cross-functional alignment.
And it also occurs to me that what fails to get appreciated by the broader group is the scientific challenge of accessing medicines post trial. Because a trial follows principles of a controlled environment, inclusion exclusion criteria, pharmacovigilance requirements. Who handles safety? Who's responsible?
Yeah, I think one of the clear trend that emerges out of discussions with post-trial access requirements, research organization is transitioning into a healthcare
Hmm.
system. We
Care of
are getting
healthcare.
into routine clinical care
Yes.
access.
And another point is also that post trial access is more of a burden in markets that rely on US and Europe for approval in terms of being able to access the commercial product. There is a lag. Is that adding to the pressure of giving access or demand for post trial access?
Yeah, I think you captured it correctly. So demand of post-trial access increases multiple folds when it comes to Asia Pacific region, where the lag time between the first commercial approval, say in the US or EU, and one of the Asian countries can be anywhere between 3 to 5 years.
Yeah,
So while a patient who's in the US in post-trial access on the investigation drug may take about eight,
yeah,
10 months to transition to the commercial product. But for our region, this transition can be
yes,
significantly longer. And this is because in Asia Pacific, we are still relying on the certificate of pharmaceutical products being granted from the country of origin before the regulatory dossier for commercialization is submitted. And I think that adds to these timelines. So that, of course, there'll be multiple competing countries where we have to ensure that we get our seat in the first wave or the second wave of the countries. Those are some of the challenges
yeah.
we face.
And these are such typical regulatory discussions in terms when tiers and waves. Also, I think it's compounded by the fact that some Asia Pacific countries are very conducive for high quality clinical research. So we have markets that have good medical infrastructure, good clinical site infrastructure, good healthcare tools in order to contribute to global clinical trials, right? So when you add that to the point about lag between a clinical environment and commercially available environment for a drug, there's also the fact that there are countries in our region, India, Taiwan, Korea, that do clinical trial very often. They are part of global clinical trials vis-a-vis other markets in Asia Pacific.
In Asia Pacific region, if we see the regulatory landscape and the infrastructure for clinical trials, I would say we have countries like South Korea, Taiwan, Australia for that matter, who are way ahead of other markets. But then we have countries like Singapore having excellent infrastructure, very positive regulatory environment, encouraging clinical trials in the country. And then we have India and China, where the infrastructure is evolving. If you see the regulatory landscape is significantly making the review and approval cycles
Mm-hmm.
shorter. And last year only China has introduced the 1 month review approval policy for clinical trials, and India is, I'm sure, working on it to make it even faster. So I think these are the countries who are already ahead of the other markets in terms of actively contributing towards global clinical trials. But then we also see excellence emerging in markets like Thailand, Vietnam, or Malaysia,
Mm-hmm.
where the infrastructure is growing
Yes.
very fast. Regulators are conscious and they are ensuring that clinical trials are given preference, and they want to make sure that uh, there is active participation into the global development.
Yeah. That. And also, there are some of these markets that need to be part of clinical trials for their local registration. So there is no avoiding trials in some markets, right? I think it gives us a clear background and some really good information, not only to see why post trial access is important from an ethical perspective, but from a practical perspective, why it can be quite widespread challenge and also has varying degrees of intensity and complexity from market to market. Why this topic can keep coming back in discussions multiple times during drug development. So, in terms of our approach with regard to sharing best practices, what are some things that a regulatory professional can think about, keep in mind, and bring to the table when this topic comes up for discussion and decisions are required.
Yeah, I think there can be three point of views to start with. So, what are the regulatory expectations, the ethical
Mm-hmm.
obligations, and cost and supply
Mm.
constraints? So, if I start with regulatory expectation, it'll be good to define the non-negotiables
Right.
first. So, why, especially in case of multi-region clinical trials, we can identify the countries where post-trial access is mandatory. That's
Yes.
non-negotiable, and then we can also group the next set of countries where it is ethically expected but
Yes.
flexible, and where it is optional but scrutinized. So
Mm.
I think it's important to distinguish between these countries. And also, we need to add a decision framework, that it's not an unlimited promise. So the ethical obligations are
Yes.
real, but they are contextual. They're not absolute, right? So it's very important to have that decision framework on how long the drug should be provided, what is the basis of deciding this duration, alternative or reasonable alternatives available, what is the criteria of defining that the patient is getting benefit from the investigational
Yes.
drug. And like the other point I said is to build cost and supply constraint into
Mm-hmm.
the design, not after the
Yes.
fact. So we consider the last country to get commercial approval and plan our supplies for post-trial access basis the timelines of the last
Yes.
country.
And what I'm hearing you say is that a framework is necessary in order to find the best way of handling this challenge. Because the easy way to do it is to just look at countries where it's complicated and say, okay, we will not have them as part of the trial. But it's a short term fix, it's very myopic, and it's also not really helping the depth of research that could be possible. I think it's important also to recognize that this is sensitive from a political view as well. We do have folks who may not fully appreciate the scientific guardrails and limitations, and these could be driving the emotional engagement from a broader population. Regulators who are part of the government, while they appreciate the scientific aspects, also need to sensitively balance population's understanding. And that is an important challenge. Are you aware of any policy work on this in your experience?
I think, Jacob, you have raised a very valid point. And like we were discussing short while back, that post COVID, there is a increased amount of awareness and interest amongst various external
Yes.
stakeholders. And I think we need to ensure that the awareness and the curiosity turns into informed decision making. And for that to happen, there is a need for wider
Yes.
education on this subject. And that is possible where I think the regulatory organizations in the country, the regulators, and the media can come into play and they can play a bigger role.
Yes. Yes, that's true. I cannot end any discussion in today's context without thinking about how artificial intelligence and technology can play a role. So, if we look at this subject from the perspective of workflows, there are several workflows that are executed by several stakeholders. Allow AI to maybe come up with options and compare it to what we are doing today.
Absolutely. It's a very interesting topic. And from my limited knowledge, there is a great role agentic AI can play in this area where we connect R&D decision
Yes.
making, say with supply
Mm.
chain. So this agentic AI is trying to create those decision frameworks for R&D in terms of what is expected, what has to be done, basis the geographies that we are
Yes.
considering. And then for us, it may take much longer time. But for AI, they can, in a few minutes, come up with a conclusion. What should be our supply and manufacturing strategy to manage post-trial access expectations in the countries participating? I think AI can play a much bigger role in bringing or streamlining the post-trial access decision making requirements, and maybe to some extent the communication with various stakeholders.
Yes, that's right. It can give us also options, and then we can think on top of those options much more critically. So, yeah, thank you for this great conversation. Do you have any other points that come to your mind before we close the call?
In fact, no, I was thinking on the AI topic
Yes.
further, and I thought sometimes our human tendency is to think in binary terms. What if the trial is successful? What if the trial is not successful? Those two scenarios we are thinking. But with inclusion of AI, we can access models beyond these binary terms. We can have stepwise models. We can think about multiple scenarios and plan even better. So that was one thought came to my mind after
I
that.
think we should come back on this topic and discuss again, but purely from the lens of the use case with artificial intelligence. Yeah.
Certainly.
All right. Thank you, Rahul. It was a very eye-opening discussion, and I am particularly happy that we were able to talk about this topic that engages more than regulatory. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jacob. Thank you for inviting me. And this was one topic which was very close to my heart, and I've been trying to share my learnings with fellow R&D professionals. So I'm really thankful for giving me this opportunity. Like I said, I'm also a learner in this area, and any further contribution from fellow colleagues is most welcome. And I'll look forward to more inputs.
Thank you. Thank you, Rahul. So till next time, take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Take care.